Welcome to this edition of Inside the Human School, where we each share some background on how the Human School came to be, as well as something that resonated with us regarding the compass points and mind shifts. We hope to share a little bit about how we work behind the scenes as learners too. I'm Rachel.
I'm Randy.
And I'm Chad.
As we engage in this conversation each week, we want to share a bit about our growth and processes at the Human School first. So this week's Inside the Human School question is, where did the idea for the Mindshift cards come from?
So it kind of is connected to the mind, why the mind shift. So let's sort of go back to that. So this idea of transforming schools is really starting with challenging our assumptions or uncovering the assumptions that oftentimes we don't see. And so that leads to this idea of mindsets. It's what we believe, and what we want to do here at the Human School is push people to think differently. So that's why we say mind shifts. So we want to ask questions and be curious about what are those underlying assumptions that we have about the education system that we need to actually think different about so that we can release this opportunity for transformation and change. And so how did the Mindshift cards come out of that? This is really challenging work. It's, we use the word friction a lot, but there's a lot of friction with changing schools. And part of that friction, one of those frictions is energy, and it can be very taxing on us to constantly think about this. So the idea of the Mindshift cards was really as some sort of tactile, real thing you could put in your hands that you could have access to at any time that you wanted to, whether you were sitting alone at your desk, whether you were in a team meeting, whether you were in a professional development with a bunch of other people, you could have them at the table. You could use these to sort of keep you attached to the ideas. Because when we run across ideas in our lives that might resonate with us, but require a lot of our effort, we tend to get drawn back to the old ways of thinking. So the idea of the Mindshift cards was really to keep people engaged and active in the real work of changing how we think about education, because it's really, you got to keep at it. It's like lifting weights and training yourself and getting exercise. You can't just do it once and then think it's all good.
One of the things that happens a lot of times in schools too, is that we don't have the time or make the space to have these bigger philosophical questions, right? So we're so driven by the day-to-day operational type things, and they're still important. I don't want to disregard them, but one of the things I really loved about this idea from the beginning was the depth at which you can uncover people's thinking through questioning, and whether we're really good as educators at taking the time to just stop and have that 5-minute conversation. So, a question like last week we discussed, how often do you design alone? I'm not so sure when we talk about that with educators, they might say, well, I don't have time or space to collaborate and write lesson plans together. But a question like, how often do you design alone? Why do you design alone? Can uncover what some of those pieces are. And so we talked about, maybe there's a fear, maybe there is a lack of, feeling good, the lack of self-esteem around it, or maybe there's a feeling of judgment from others. But hopefully opening up people to conversations around the why, as opposed to being so purely focused on the what.
And I was going to add just what our process in that. So we looked at the compass points and the mind shifts, and then we each took a crack at designing questions that we thought were worthwhile within each of those mind shifts that people might want to either talk about, or that could be recentering for them, or that could kind of push their thinking. So we each created these massive lists of our own, and then we came back together and we looked through them. We gave each other feedback on the questions, and then we decided from there what ones we wanted to stick with, and ended up with a really great combination of each other's questions as part of each of the sets, or part of each of the compass points in the cards. And so that was for us definitely an iterative process. And we've talked about doing other versions of them as well as we move forward in this. Anything else you guys want to add on that?
Good job creating the questions, Chad and Rachel.
I was going to let it be all of us.
What I would add to that just real quickly was,
Yeah.
I would say that we really are intentionally doing our best to be iterative, to learn in public, to learn socially, all these things that we believe are core to the work. When you think about being an objector, being an inventor, being a curator, and then storyteller, even designing the cards, we were trying to object to the ways that people typically talked about this. When we think about inventing, we designed collaboratively together. When you're curating, we're collecting feedback from people who are using the cards, or feedback from the fact that, maybe not a lot of people have resonated with them. And then we're going to tell a different story around that. So I would want to bring forth this idea that where it may not always be obvious, we really are trying to live our compass points through our work, and to do it in a way that's really public. That's the last thing I would share around that.
Absolutely. So let's talk about what we're curious about, or what we're learning this week. So one of the things that I was reading this week is the book Innovator's DNA from Jeff Dyer. That was part of a group that I was meeting with. And what I found really fascinating is he has kind of a similar framework in some ways to our compass points. But for the purpose is about being an innovator or becoming an innovator. Oh my gosh, innovator. It's early. So one of the things that I thought was really interesting is that his whole first part is around questioning and asking questions, and he gives some great anecdotes about different innovators and their questioning patterns. And what I really loved is the focus not on asking questions for the sake of questioning. Adam Grant talks about being disagreeable, not that. Instead, asking questions as people who are new to a situation about why we do the things that we do, and not to be difficult, but to learn. And so he gives a great example of a female innovator who took over a large company and their process, and then just asked, why do we do this? Why do we have so many iterations present? What is the purpose? Without saying, I don't think this is a good idea. She just asked questions. The other thing that it made me think about too is the role of observation. I remember that being a big part of design thinking 20 years ago, and thinking about in our framework where observation might fit in was something that was sort of circling still in my head. So, Randy, what about you?
So I'm teaching a class this semester on supervision and evaluation, and Chad helped me design it so that it includes some coaching and conversations. So we're reading Jim Knight's Better Conversations. And the conversations we've had as a group have been really rich and good. But one thing that I found that's been fascinating is that when we try to do scenarios and actually put some of the ideas into action, people really struggle. Last week we were talking about toxic conversations, and they've all experienced toxic conversations. But when you go through some toxic conversation scenarios, they really struggle to detoxify the conversation. And so I'm laughing, but I think the learning is that whether it's conversations or transforming schools or something else, it's one thing to read about it. It's another thing to actually push yourself into the deep end, feel uncomfortable, and actually develop the skill to carry out what your beliefs are. So it sort of brought me back to this work here that we're doing, and the discomfort that people feel when they have to translate their actions to align with their beliefs.
It's funny because I'm making the connection to what I'm reading this week and thinking a lot about is I'm in the middle of Amy Marie Brown's book Emergent Strategy, and I'm going to read just 2 lines from the introduction. I'm pretty deep into it, but I love these 2 as kind of an introduction. So she uses the quote, "Emergence is the way complex systems and patterns arise out of a multiplicity of relatively simple interactions. And so the concept of emergence is, in a way, the concept of uncovering, or we talk about, enrolling people in conversations as opposed to a powerful, demand. And in this way, there's this juxtaposition between the word strategy, which is like essentially designing for emergence, which is something that is going to develop, can be developed through design, but in a slow, process-oriented way, but is maybe not as obvious. And then she follows it up with this, which I think speaks to what Randy was talking about, through the power and the value of conversations. She says that emergence emphasizes critical connections over critical mass, building authentic relationships, listening with the senses of the body and the mind. And this idea that there is a desire to design to change everything, as opposed to this desire to just build from an authentic place. So she uses that phrase, critical connections over critical mass. And it just reminds me that this work is slow. It is intentional, but it is about creating space and allowing things to emerge, as opposed to just simply saying everybody's got to do this one way. And so when I connect to the Human School, we're not trying to tell everybody that there's one way to do this work. What we believe is that schools and classrooms and systems can be much more focused on the human and less having dehumanized structures, but that because each context is different, because each person is different, we need to allow that to emerge. And so I suspect at times there are maybe people who don't, and we can do a certainly better job of helping people to understand what we're trying to accomplish, but who think there's going to be this step-by-step magic bullet, if you do this, then this will happen. And the reality is that is not the work. It's about developing emergent strategy, if I'm going to reference the text. So I have found her language to be really refreshing and thoughtful and intentional. I'm looking forward to unpacking it even more.
Thanks, guys. So we wanted to thank you so much for learning alongside us for this edition of Inside the Human School, where our goal is to learn in public and share a little bit about how we're learning this week and intend to learn about more in the future. Visit thehuman.school and its Learning in Public hub for additional resources, and join the conversation in our Facebook community, committed to placing humanity at the center of all design. Thanks so much, guys.
Bye, guys.
Bye.
Bye-bye.